If you want to know why so many people work harder every year and still feel like they are not moving forward, the answer is usually not a lack of effort. It is a lack of structure. That is the first thing I would want you to understand. People imagine wealth as something dramatic, a huge salary, a lucky stock, a business exit, a perfect real estate move. Fine, those things exist. But for ordinary people, durable wealth is much less theatrical. It is often built through one quiet transition that most people never make. They stop treating money like stored labor, and they start treating it like a worker. That is the mother line. The whole purpose of a sensible asset allocation system is not to impress anyone. It is to stop asking your labor to carry your entire future by itself. That is why this uploaded reference is more important than it looks. On the surface, it is a simple personal finance video about how to turn $10,000 into $300,000 in the lazy way. But underneath that language, the real message is much more valuable. Money left in the wrong place quietly dies. Money placed into the right machine slowly develops agency. And when that agency becomes large enough, the owner stops depending only on what he earns this month. That is the real shift. The document starts with the right enemy, inflation. Good, because inflation is one of the most politely destructive forces in modern life. It does not break into your house in a ski mask. It does not shout. It does not announce the theft. It just slowly changes what your dollars can buy while most people keep confusing nominal safety with real safety. The number in the account stays the same. The purchasing power does not. That is why I have very little patience for the phrase, at least it's safe in the bank, when what people really mean is at least I can see the number not moving. A number that does not move while your expenses keep rising is not defending you. It is simply sitting there while life gets more expensive around it. That is not safety. That is surrender with a login screen. This is the first mechanism I want you to understand. I call it the sleeping. Money penalty, a dollar in the wrong place is not resting. It is shrinking. The source document explains this with bank yields that lag inflation, and that basic comparison is enough to wake any serious person up. If prices are rising faster than the yield on idle cash, then the account is not preserving your future purchasing power. It is quietly weakening it. That is why a passive bank balance can become such a trap for hardworking households. They keep sacrificing time to save, but then they stop one step too early and leave the capital in a place where it never begins performing its second job. That second job matters. The first job of money is spending. The second job of money is production. If the second job never begins, labor remains trapped doing everything alone. Now let me slow down because this is where naive people hurt themselves. I am not saying every dollar should be thrown into risk immediately. The source document is right to preserve a safety layer first. I would describe it as emotional runway, a person with no reserve, no cash cushion, and no room for surprises, not ready to invest boldly, because the first broken transmission, medical bill, or sudden loss of income will turn the portfolio into emergency cash at exactly the wrong time. That is not a system. That is fragility disguised as enthusiasm. This is the second mechanism. I call it reserve before courage. People love to sneer at cash because cash is boring. Fine, it is boring. Good, a reserve fund is supposed to be boring. Its purpose is not to outperform. Its purpose is to stop you from liquidating long-term assets during short-term stress. It is psychological insulation. It is what lets you look at market volatility without instantly hearing the voice in your head say, what if I need that money next week? That is why I think the first layer in the reference document is stronger than it looks. 20% in cash or near cash sounds unambitious. Wonderful. Unambitious reserves make ambitious investing possible. The owner who knows he can survive a leaking roof, a layoff, or a car problem with cash is much less likely to destroy the rest of the system when trouble appears. That matters more than one extra point of return ever will. Now we get to the heart of the allocation, the growth engine. This is where most people become stupid because they are too impressed by excitement. They want the perfect stock, the perfect sector, the perfect fund, the perfect entry, the perfect macro thesis. And while they keep searching for the ideal story, the market keeps rewarding people who simply built a broadly intelligent machine and kept feeding it. That is why I have always respected broad market ownership more than investing theater. You do not need to be entertained by your portfolio. You need it to work. The source document proposes a stock and bond structure inside the growth engine with more weight toward broad stock ETFs and a stabilizing bond allocation. Good. That is what a real machine looks like. Not because bonds are thrilling, not because broad market ETFs make anyone feel brilliant at dinner, because a serious long-term system should be designed to survive decades, not just look smart for a quarter. This is the third mechanism. I call it machine building. Most investors think a portfolio is a collection of ideas. It is not. A real portfolio is a machine with assigned jobs. One piece provides broad ownership of productive businesses. One piece provides some stability. One piece provides dry powder. One piece may provide income. Another may smooth volatility. What matters is not how clever each part sounds in isolation. What matters is whether the whole machine can keep operating across inflation, recessions, headline shocks, and your own psychological swings. That is where adults win, not because they were the smartest in the room, because they built something that did not depend on feeling smart every week. Now, the source document uses a washing machine analogy, and I think that is exactly right. Good passive investing should feel like a machine cycle, not like a daily emergency. Choose the cycle. Load it correctly, press start, check it occasionally, let it do its work. The public keeps wanting investing to be more exciting than that, and that desire is precisely what costs them money. They mistake activity for control. They mistake chart watching for seriousness. They mistake constant updates for competence. Usually the opposite is true. If your investment process keeps you glued to a screen, it may be feeding your nervous system more than your net worth. That is not what I want. This is the fourth mechanism. I call it friction removal. Wealth grows best when the number of emotional decisions required is reduced. The more often the owner must feel like acting, the more likely the plan eventually gets interrupted by mood. That is why automation matters so much. The source document is right to emphasize automatic transfers and regular purchases. An automated contribution is stronger than an inspired contribution because inspiration is unreliable. Automatic behavior is much better. This is one of the great hidden truths of finance. The person who automates modest wisdom often beats the person who waits around for peak conviction, because conviction is moody, automation is patient. Now let us talk about the third layer, the flexible cash or opportunity bullets, because this part is psychologically powerful when handled correctly and dangerous when turned into a religion. The reference text uses it as a reserve for clear market drops. I understand that instinct. I do not want people worshiping cash forever, but I do want them understanding what optional liquidity can do during stress. A person with no dry powder experiences declines mainly as pain. A person with some dry powder and a defined deployment rule experiences them partly as opportunity. That is a completely different emotional world. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it prepared aggression. The problem with most investors is not that they fail to predict crashes. The problem is that they enter every cycle with no prepared response to a crash. So when the market falls hard, they do not know whether to freeze, sell, buy, or wait. That uncertainty creates terrible behavior. A modest tactical reserve with rules can solve part of that problem. It does not mean you are a macro wizard. It means you are no longer psychologically naked during volatility. That matters a great deal. Now, I want to be careful. Opportunity cash is useful only if it serves the system. If it becomes an excuse to stay underinvested forever while waiting for the perfect dip, then it turns from strategic flexibility into delay disguised as discipline. I have seen that mistake many times. People talk about patience when what they really mean is fear. They talk about better entry points while the market keeps climbing without them. So yes, keep some dry powder if it helps you behave better. No, do not turn dry powder into a permanent identity. A good reserve exists to serve deployment, not avoidance. That is the difference. Now let us reach the heart of the promise in the source document, because this is where ordinary people either become motivated or dismissive. How can $10,000 turn into $300,000? How can a tiny monthly contribution matter? How can something this boring change a life? The answer is compounding, but most people still do not understand compounding in lived terms. They know the word, they do not know the rhythm. Compounding begins in invisibility. That is why it is so often disrespected. The account inches forward, the deposits feel small, the dividend payments feel almost insulting, the progress looks weak compared with the labor required to produce the deposits. This is exactly where most people lose. They think the slow start is evidence the system is not working. It is not. It is evidence they are early. That is all. This is the sixth mechanism. I call it the invisible beginning. Every compounding curve feels stupid in the early stage. That is why almost nobody respects it until later. The owner makes contributions, the portfolio grows, a little more contributions, a little more growth, reinvested dividends, slightly more future capacity. A base is forming, but because the evidence is delayed, the emotions often revolt. This is nothing. This will take forever. I need something faster. Those thoughts are not evidence. They are symptoms of a brain that wants immediate proof from a delayed return system. That brain must be overruled. Compounding asks for obedience before it offers applause. That is a hard bargain. It is also how people get rich quietly. The source document projects a long-run value with continued additions, and the broad logic is sound. 10,000 alone can grow meaningfully over long periods. 10,000 plus regular monthly additions can become something far larger. Not because the owner found a secret, because the owner stayed inside a productive machine long enough for the math to stop looking unimpressive. This is where I want to insert a very important warning. None of these projections are guarantees. Markets do not owe you a straight line. Bond yields change equity, returns change, valuations matter. Some decades are generous, some are punishing, some are weird. I have no respect for promising a fixed future outcome from a variable system, but I also have no patience for the opposite error, which is acting as though uncertainty cancels the long-run logic of ownership. It does not. This is the seventh mechanism. I call it uncertain abundance. A paycheck is relatively certain in the short term and limited in the long term. A compounding portfolio is uncertain in the short term and often much stronger. In the long term, that is the trade. People cling to wages because wages feel immediate. Fine. But wages can stall, disappear, or fail to outrun inflation. A portfolio can disappoint too. Yes, but productive assets across enough time have historically done something wages alone do not do. They accelerate, they begin creating growth that is no longer perfectly tied to the hours you personally sold that month. That is the point of the entire enterprise, not excitement, not drama, liberation from labor monopoly. And now we come to the part I think the source document hints at, but does not fully press hard enough. Human capital. Good, because investing is not your only compounding engine. Your earning power matters too. In fact, early in life, it may be the most important financial asset you possess. A person who improves skills, increases income, and raises investable surplus while simultaneously running an efficient investment machine creates a far more powerful flywheel than a person who focuses on one side alone. This is the eighth mechanism. I call it dual compounding. Capital compounds, capability compounds. Raise your skills and your income grows. Raise your income and your contributions grow. Raise your contributions and your capital compounds faster. This is one reason I dislike treating investing as a hobby separate from the rest of life. It is part of a system. You do not improve your balance sheet only by selecting assets. You improve it by becoming more productive, more resilient, and more deliberate about where every future dollar goes. The worker who becomes more valuable and the owner who keeps buying productive assets are not running two separate strategies. They are feeding the same future. Now let me speak honestly about the emotional pain. The source text references the 2020 decline, and that matters because everyone loves compounding until the line bends downward. That is the real test. When markets drop hard, the portfolio stops feeling like a machine and starts feeling like betrayal. The novice sees danger. The prepared owner sees process. That is why reserves matter. That is why allocation matters. That is why rebalancing matters. That is why systems matter. The portfolio is easy to praise in a bull market. It proves itself when everything in you wants to interrupt it. That is the actual examination. So here is where I come down. $10,000 is not powerful because it is huge. It is powerful because it is enough to force a psychological shift, enough to build a three-layer system, enough to stop money from sleeping, and enough to begin proving that labor does not have to do every job forever. A reserve layer for psychological and practical stability, a growth engine built from broad productive ownership, a modest opportunity layer for prepared aggression, automatic contributions, periodic rebalancing, more respect for process than prediction, more respect for skill growth than investing theater. That is a real system. And the reason the lazy way can actually work so well is that it is lazy only about one thing. It is lazy about interference. That is intelligent. A good long-term investor should be ambitious about structure and lazy about drama. He should build a machine, feed the machine, rebalance the machine, and let the machine do its work while he uses the rest of his life for family. Health, skill, and sanity. That is a much better deal than living in constant reaction. This strategy will not make anyone rich by next month. Good. Anything that promises that is usually selling adrenaline, not ownership. What this strategy can do is more valuable. It can slowly reduce the number of hours your future self must sell. It can make your money begin sharing the burden. It can turn stored effort into a second engine, And if you stay with it long enough, one day you will realize something extraordinary. The account is no longer just a pile of numbers you contributed to. It has become a worker. It is producing while you rest. It is growing while you live. It is carrying part of the future without asking your body to do all of it. That is the real promise here. Not wealth for its own sake. And choice is what money is really supposed to buy. Not just the ability to spend, the ability to decide how much to work, decide how much stress to tolerate, decide how much dependence on the next paycheck you are willing to accept. There is one more reason I respect this kind of structure so much. It changes the owner-S relationship to bad news. Most people consume economic headlines as victims. Inflation is bad, rates are bad, recession is bad, market declines are bad. Everything enters the mind as something done to them. But a person with a functioning allocation system begins consuming the same headlines differently, not with joy, not with denial, but with a different posture. Rising rates may improve short-term cash yield. Falling markets may improve future expected returns. Recessions may create better entry points. Volatility may become a source of accumulation instead of only fear. That shift is not emotional positivity. It is structural confidence. And structural confidence is what turns ordinary savers into long-term owners. This is the ninth mechanism. I call it narrative immunity. The person without a system must interpret every headline from scratch. That is exhausting. One week the market is up and he feels late. The next week the market is down and he feels relieved. He waited, then prices rise again and he feels stupid. Then a recession article appears and he feels wise for staying out. This is no way to build wealth. It is just a sequence of emotional reactions to information that was never supposed to be managed emotionally in the first place. A real system immunizes the owner from most of that. It does not eliminate fear, but it reduces the number of times fear gets to vote. The transfer still happens. The funds still buy. The rebalancing still happens. The reserve still exists. The machine keeps operating while the headlines take turns pretending they are destiny. That is a much better way to live. And there's one last point I want to make about laziness, because people often misunderstand what the best kind of financial laziness really is. Good laziness is not neglect. Good laziness is refusing to spend precious life energy on tasks that do not improve expected outcomes enough to justify the attention they demand. That means you can be lazy about daily market watching and still be serious about money. You can be lazy about hot gossip and still be disciplined about monthly funding. You can be lazy about prediction and still be meticulous about allocation. That is the kind of laziness I admire. The lazy investor, when designed correctly, is often the investor most respectful of reality. He knows he is not smarter than the market every week. He knows his emotions become dangerous when overexposed to noise. He knows the future is built more reliably through repetition than through dramatic bursts of brilliance. So he constructs a machine sturdy enough to run without constant supervision, and then he goes back to living a useful life. That is not passivity. That is wisdom under constraint. And wisdom under constraint is exactly what ordinary workers need if they want a path to freedom that does not require turning themselves into full-time amateur fund managers. That is why a boring allocation system deserves so much respect, because when it is fed consistently enough, it does something extraordinary in the background. It quietly converts discipline today into freedom later. And that is about as close to magic as finance ever gets.